Can you tell us your name, your date of birth, and where you were born?
My name is William J. Becker. I was born in Evanston, Illinois on 9 July 1919.
And do you have any other family members that were in the military? Your father or any other?
My father was in World War I.
And was he in Europe?
I don't know the details on that.
Okay. And, Army or?
Army, I understand.
And why did you enter into the service?
Well, I was deciding what to do, and I had a new job that I was going to get, and I said, well, the war is going to come whether we want it or not. And talked over the family, and they said, yeah, you might as well get in now while you got a chance. So that's why I enlisted, knowing there was a war coming, and so I enlisted in the Army Air Corps.
And when was that you enlisted?
October 2nd, 1940.
And what was your original MOS?
Communications specialist.
What exactly would that entail?
Well, I never really did it. Communications in the Air Force, would have been maintaining Air Force equipment, communications equipment in the aircraft. And actually what happened, I went to school for that, and at Scott Air Force Base. But they kept me there and I taught as an instructor.
So you went through the training and then you just turned right around and as an
They
instructor?
drafted a certain number to be instructors. I'd already been through a school called RCA Institute in Chicago, which taught communications. What there was at radio, and mainly, of course, all of what it was in those days.
And do you remember where you were when you heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
I sure do. I was on a date in Sparta, Illinois. And the dirty people said, come back to the base. Why, I'll never know. But so I had to go back to the base, and I didn't finish the date.
Did you hear about it on the radio?
No, I didn't hear about it on radio. I heard it, well, yeah, eventually I heard about it. Somebody told me about it. I didn't hear it directly.
And at that time, you were in the military, obviously.
Yes.
How did that make you feel, knowing that you were about to be thrown in the middle of a large-scale war? Okay.
Nothing special, because I knew, it would be a while. I wouldn't worry. Didn't really affect me any. We expected it.
And so, after you attended the training and then you became an instructor, at some point you went to OCS, is that right?
Well, yes, I taught at Scott Air Force Base, and then we opened up a new school at the Stevens Hotel in Chicago. And at that hotel I became a senior instructor. And it's from there that I went to OCS. I was encouraged to apply for OCS, and I did. And then I went to OCS from there.
And where did you go through OCS at?
Miami Beach.
That's not a bad assignment.
I don't know about that. I'm not sure.
Now, what type of specialized training did you undergo at that point? You changed your...
Well, OCS is... the course I was taking was supply. But you're so tired in OCS most of the time, you absorb things, but you don't absorb all of it. But I came out of there with a supply MOS. But at the time I left, I'd been drafted because of my communications equipment and experience by the Air Weather Service.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the Air Weather Service does and your role?
Yeah, the Air Weather Service, of course, is the one that provides all the forecasts for the entire service, all the services, especially during the war, Army Air Corps, and told them how they could fly, when they could fly, more when they could fly. Although that wasn't always the case; they flew anyway sometimes. And that was basically the job of the Weather Service. I was sent to a laboratory to train, because it was the Signal Corps Laboratory was developing weather radar and weather radiosondes and spherics equipment, which you probably never heard of. Those three we were taught, and at the same time they brought in a professor from one of the colleges to teach us weather equipment, weather forecasting. And so we had kind of a broad education time for about 2 months, what you call pressure. We ended up with a pretty poor weather forecaster, but we all already knew the equipment, so that wasn't a problem. And from there I was sent to Australia.
And what year would that have been?
1943.
How did you get to Australia?
Flew.
Flew.
I was a requisition. When you're requisitioned, you get there quick.
Can you tell us about your time in Australia?
Well, when I got to Australia, I was given the job of the communications officer. Weather engineering officer does two things, I should say that. I'm a supply officer for the squadron, but I'm also an engineering officer, which means that I had to ensure that the new radiosondes and radars and spherics were installed. And since I was the only technician there that knew anything about them, I had to go on each one of them that was installed. So we installed probably 12 different places all through New Guinea and eventually up into Philippines, and I had to go on each one of those. If that helps you any. Not perhaps. Some of them, for example, we would go install it at Port Moresby, which was the place where our headquarters was. And incidentally, I never forget telling this, as you went into Port Moresby, there was a big sign up there, through these portals past the best mosquito bait in the world. And so I've never forgotten that. I knew I was part of that bait. But we installed a radio sound station in Port Moresby. Then I would go back to Australia, Townsville, get another team together. We installed one in Milne Bay. Now Milne Bay is on the other side, right across from where the Japanese were actually located. We installed radio sounds there, and that was the first place I realized there were zeros. One thing you do when you go into that area, you always dug a trench. When I say a slit trench, you all acquainted with slit trench, it's rather narrow, because then if they're strafing, they can't get you, supposedly. So we ended up in that trench several times until the P-38s came over and were able to get rid of them. Also, that was the last place that the Japanese had gotten into Australia, as far as they got in New Guinea there. And they had fought on one side of the runway while we were on the other side of the runway. I didn't feel that I was an infantryman, but there are times when you do things you have to do. So then from there we went to another place which was called, let's see, the next one we did was I'm thinking my names of my cities. It was in Dutch New Guinea, and it was on that side of the other side of right across from Australia, and we installed a radio sound station there, and that was interesting too, because the Chinese had gotten out of Indonesia just in time before the Japanese got there, and they'd settled there. And we got to know them, and they said, you know, if you'll give us some chickens, we will be able to give you the eggs and maybe some chickens. And I said, well, we'll see what we can do. And then one of the men that were there was a farmer. He said, you know, I could milk a cow. So believe it or not, we eventually went back to Australia and were able to load a C-47 up with a cow and chickens, and actually took them over there. And they were then, I don't know what happened to the cow. I've always wondered about that one. The chickens went to the Chinese, and then our people said, yeah, they were getting fresh eggs, which is different the way you live. So that's the kind of thing that we had. We also had something else that I've always felt was a pretty good thing. We had a rule at Townsville that whenever anything came in that was not assigned to any organization, for the captain down there to call us and tell us. Well, he called us one day and said, I've got a refrigerator trailer here that nobody's requisitioned. Are you interested? I said, I'll be down there with a requisition in a minute. So we got that, and that kept us beer and liquor, so that whenever we went up to service our people, all of our C-47, it carried that with it too. Because people needed to be taken care of. They're number one. Now I installed stations at Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea, which is the last place we were in New Guinea. From there we went on into the Philippines. And so those are just a few of the places that I installed. And I'd say about a total of 10 different places that we installed. Cooktown was one of them. We installed at Cooktown. And this going on over a period of years, of course, as we went along. Then we were getting ready to go into Leyte, and we already had guerrillas in the Philippines. General MacArthur got together a group of people, I was one of them, and said, we want to put weather stations in the Philippines so we know what the weather's going to be like. And so he said, And he said, of course, I need volunteers. Well, fortunately, I was not one he asked to volunteer to go in, but my buddy, my friends were. But I was just to supply them, be sure they got the supplies they needed. And so they went into there. Now, I was in on the landing at Lady, however, because we had to set up a weather station there as quickly so that we could give the weather information to the pilots as they did the work. So that was just kind of an indication. We went into Lady, and of course Lady was a mess of mud. And then from Lady, after that, we ended up going into Manila, and that was really the culmination of our initial job, was to get the Philippines back. That's what MacArthur's job was. He wanted that. So all that went over a period of 2 years, and it was a constant moving back from Townsville to some station to install, Townsville to some other place to install, and once in a while we got a chance to go to Sydney and have a little fun. Not very often. I think once I got that chance.
Can you said that you guys put up about 10 stations. Can you explain how that would, particularly in New Guinea, where there's still combat operations actively going on, how would that work? Would your unit follow a brigade that had cleared that area? They would give you guys support at the time, or how exactly would that work?
A good example might be near Lae, New Guinea. We had an invasion. We invaded a place there. And well, the minute they start building the strip, we were in there. In other words, the Army would go in and invade, and then they start building the strip. And we went in there at the same time. And we started putting our radio sound stations up and our communication centers up. So we were there usually right after them. After they got in there, we immediately got started getting the weather up. Because it was a real problem for us in the Weather Service. We had what we called single station forecasting in the early part of the war. We had no information at all from the Japanese area. I didn't have any idea what the weather was there, except for what we could work out ourselves. So the radio sound would go up. You acquainted with what a radio sound is? It goes up to the balloon and tells us temperature and humidity and pressure as it goes up. And that is transmitted back. And then you see it here now, and then 12 hours later you see it again, and you can pretty well track what the weather is actually doing. So in doing that, you can then get an idea of what's up ahead of you. At least you hoped you could. So that was what we call single station forecasting. To supplement that, the B-25s have a little place in the nose, which weather people eventually, and I was one time I had to do this, we flew over an enemy area and got the weather. That wasn't the best way to go, because one of them that I went to, we got a little backache. And I said, this isn't what I came over here for. But, but that's how we got the weather sometimes. Sometimes by single station forecasting, sometimes just go get it.
New Guinea is famous for having horrible weather, and you mentioned the mosquitoes. Can you tell us what life is like in living in New Guinea during time of war?
It's hot. It's hot. And some places like Finch Haven, which I didn't mention earlier, but rained all the time. I mean, it was just one mess of mud. And it was just miserable. But we ignored that. You ignore the weather like that because you have to live with it. And you have to go. So even though, yes, it was bad weather all the way through. Well, in Milne Bay, when I went there, when it rains there, it rains 12 to 18 inches. So in installing the radio sound station, we had to find a way to get it up 18 to 24 inches so that it wouldn't flood every time it rained. It's hard to believe how it rains in some of those places. If you haven't been in the tropics, you've missed something. Or in the jungle. In the jungle, in the one place we went to, the jungle we had to go through that to get to our place and clear it out. And I mean, the jungle's oppressive. The best word is oppressive. And weather's not good in the tropics. No, but you lived with what you were there.
Ever get sick?
No. Well, what the term sick? Yeah, I got malaria a couple times. I got malaria a couple times. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't remembered that. I got it 2 or 3 times back in the States after the war too. But, you look at these things and you say to yourself, well, it's what you get through.
Tell us about your time in the Philippines. You talked a little bit about it, but can you tell us about how that operation went?
Well, the operation went, of course, Lady was no problem at all. And I say it wasn't any problem. It was the Japanese weren't there. And so therefore it was rather easy to go in. I did not go in the other invasion where they had the actual opposition. But I had a lot of friends. In supplying the New Guinea, the guerrillas, we had to supply the guerrillas with everything they needed because they went in there without any food or anything like that. And they set up a communications center on Zamboanga and everything was transmitted to them from the stations. We had 30 stations. And they would transmit the current weather to them, and then they would transmit it back to Australia. My job was to keep them supplied. We did that through submarines. We strapped the radio stuff on the submarines and sent it in. And an interesting side story on that, Lady, to check when there was the right time to invade Lady, they sent in a Navy intelligence officer. And he looked and checked to see what the weather was going to be and what it looked like and realized the Japanese weren't there. So then he wanted to go signal. He was supposed to signal the submarines out there, it's okay or not okay. And he lost his signaling device. So we had a weather station there. So he took the bed cover from the weather station and used that to signal to the submarines that it was okay to come in and invade. Little stories on the side, But it was Australia, of course, Philippines was pretty settled by the time we finished there. But that from there is where we staged then to go into Tokyo.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, I went into Tokyo twice actually. We staged. First stage, we had to put in a weather station and an operations center at Atsugi Airport to help get some of the troops in. And so I was in that airplane, and we landed, taxied that airplane over to the side, and used that as the communication center. We were able to use the Japanese weather equipment and set up the station. Then I went back to Philippines. That's all we did, set it up and got it going. Then we came back in again in September, early September, when we came in to take over the Japanese Weather Service. And we came in and the whole group, you'll see some pictures of that, in which we all came in and immediately went into Tokyo, scared as the devil. For a bunch of weather people, we had more machine guns and guns than you can imagine, and we probably wouldn't have known what to do with them. And we went in there and took over the Japanese Weather Service, Meteorological Center. No problem, they were happy to have us there because they weren't being treated very well by the troops, but I didn't know what they were. And so we moved in and took over that service. And then we investigated all the things and the history of the things. One historical thing that a lot of people don't notice, during World War II, they tried to bomb our west coast by balloons, what we call constant level balloons. And they were pretty successful, but our newspapers didn't report it. And what we found out when we investigated, they had not heard anything back, and so they assumed that it wasn't working, and that's when they stopped it. And actually, an interesting point is we learned a lot from that because we used it ourselves later on in the war with the Russians and Soviet. But it was an interesting time in Australia, in Japan, looking over everything that they had done and what they had done. We also took equipment and took it over to Seoul to give it to the Koreans, and we also took a lot of their old equipment, new equipment really, from their warehouses and sent it into China, Shanghai, so that they could set up weather stations as well. So that was part of our job.
And you touched a little bit on it. How about tensions between the Japanese and the Americans when you were there? Was it real intense, or did...
Well, the Japanese military just disappeared. Where they were, they might have been out there working the rice fields for all we know. And they just didn't stay around. So that we had trouble getting the weather people back because we couldn't find them. And until they were satisfied that we weren't going to kill everybody, they started coming back. But the civilian side of the Weather Service were with us right away. They wanted to help. We got a picture of me with one of the leader of the Japanese Weather Service. And so they helped us find some of the military. And that was only because we wanted to know where they were located and what they were doing. And as a result of that, we made trips all over Australia with the head of the Meteorological Service, and if we could find the military, to look and see what they had in their weather business so that we could make sure the stations were operating and get them the supplies they needed. We really reset the Japanese Meteorological Weather Service so that it would operate.
Can you describe what you would consider to be probably the most exciting experience you had during the war?
Word exciting. I've never thought about it. What was exciting? I think the whole thing was exciting, but because it was so much fun. And they say it's fun, and yet now it wasn't then. But when you look back, you know, it really was enjoyable because everybody was friends. We worked together in the military, you know, just like brothers. And it's just something you just can't identify anywhere, even in civilian life. You can't identify it. That comradeship that we had. I guess that was exciting to me. Other than that, when I first got there, I ended up landing in Brisbane. And Townsville was where I wanted to go. Being a second lieutenant, the first thing somebody we got a second lieutenant, we put him in charge of the train. So we had a train that went with troops from Brisbane to Townsville, and I was unfortunately in charge of a group of train that had probably 500 to 1,000 troops on it. And I didn't know anything, I didn't know what I was doing. And they have a real light, narrow lane gauge trains. And they would stop every once in a while, I think for a nooner, and then they go to be one house, believe it or not, and they stop there and go in that one house. And then they come out about an hour later and on we go. And we were fed by the people as we went along. But that was exciting in a way. That was my introduction to the theater. So that made me realize I was a second lieutenant. But exciting, that's a good question. What most exciting? Probably going into Tokyo. Because, you know, we had planned an invasion back a months before that. We'd done the work to plan all we needed to order for the invasion. We had actually planned at Olympic. We had a plan that said how many balloons we were going to need, how many people we need, where we need them, what kind of people, how many radio sound stations we did. We had, from the weather standpoint, we planned everything we needed for the invasion. Everybody else did too. So to go in and not have to worry about that, and to go in there and see how they completely gave up, I mean, that was exciting. It was scary at first because we didn't know whether they really were going to give up. But it was exciting.
The Weather Service played obviously an important role during the war. Most people don't think about it, with the exception possibly the D-Day forecast. Can you explain the significance of, to people who might not know, the significance on how an accurate weather forecast would play a role in air operations or even ground operations? Well,
sure. Just one simple thing. Let's suppose they decide to go bomb a nest of zeros. If the weather was covered over, they'd be wasting their time. They had cloud coverage that they couldn't see down below, or that somehow they couldn't drop their bombs. It was a waste of their time and a waste of money. So that was just one simple thing. But also the rain, because of the way the rain was, once we began to understand the weather, we could tell them what they could expect. And that was good for the ground troops. You're not going to go chase a bunch of Japanese if it's going to pour rain, because you're going to be in trouble trying to go anywhere. In fact, one time at Milne Bay, the Japanese tried to take over the place. They had one tank, and that tank got mired in mud. So that's only a few cases. But actually, weather up in the one, I mentioned Cooktown. One of the problems with Cooktown was when it rained so heavily, the airport that was then there was covered over with water. In fact, when we went in there to install our weather station, we had to go by ship because you couldn't land on the runway. So we had to build a whole new runway, which we did. And that's an indication of where weather was an important consideration there. And the storms, the storms that we had in the sea, the Coral Sea battle could have been a real disaster if we hadn't known what the weather was going to be when they came in. So you can see weather has an impact on a lot of things. I think people don't understand. Remember, the weather people in the Southwest Pacific, okay, they went along on every invasion. There was a weather station with that. We had set them up, a trailer, and everything they needed to set up a weather station. They were in the second tier of every invasion that we had in the Pacific. They went in and set up a station and started forecasting and providing information to the Air Force right away. Every single one. They were every place that there was anything that was doing, we had to do weather. We had to do aerial weather, as I mentioned, when we didn't have any other way. So you find out was everything that was combat or non, there was weather, just like there is today. So weather is still a very, very important part of the effort.
Were you married at the time?
Yes.
How did you keep in contact with your wife and your
I
family?
tried, but unfortunately my marriage didn't last the war.
What about your other family members? How would you keep in contact?
Well, they had a system of mailing that you filled. It was a short mail that you had, and it automatically went into a mail system and went back.
And was that pretty efficient?
Yeah, it was very efficient.
Can you tell people who might not be aware on how important the mail call is for the morale?
Oh yeah, you're always waiting. If you're not, especially some people never got called. We went to mail call, and they would call out your names, all the last names, and you hoped you got some mail. If you didn't get some mail, you weren't very happy about it. But unfortunately, that's the way the game is. However, I found out during that period of time my wife wasn't faithful anymore, and she was, that's the way life is.
What did you guys do to keep yourselves entertained on any little downtime you had when you were in theater?
Well, we had movies. We had sometimes. Someplace we didn't have anything. The only entertainer that I ever saw was Jack Benny. Because he would come down to where there was only 10 or 15 men. He's the only one that did that.
Where did you see him at? Do you remember?
That was in Hollandia, I believe. But a lot of them just wanted to have a big crowd, and I understand that because sometimes the way they do things, they need a big crowd. But I was never where there was a big crowd at the right time. So only ones that I got were people like, well, Jack Benny was good, he was fun. And the movies, they've showed movies regularly. We had the officers club if we could get one built, and we drank like everybody else did. And of course, Australian beer is tough. It's 12%. In fact, that was my introduction to the, when I first got into Australia, the commander, colonel, whenever he used to bet us, we had 2.5 beer, I think, in this country. And you could drink several bottles of that, no trouble at all. But he always bet everybody when they came in that they can't drink more than one bottle of Australian beer. And I said, well, of course I can. You couldn't.
What about your living conditions? Particularly in New Guinea, would you be in a tent? Would you be in a...
Most always a tent, yes. Yeah. Wherever we were, there was always bugs, mosquitoes, As I mentioned, what there was when we went into Australia, New Guinea, the mosquitoes would get on the edge. It seemed like they gathered on for you and wanted to get around into your bed before you went in there. And then you bring down the net and there they were inside. But they were there in big quantities. That's where we all got malaria. And bugs were really bad. Really bad.
What about when you were in Japan? Did you guys take over a barracks? Or?
No, we lived like kings there. Initially, we took over a organization, a building that was a university club. One of the international clubs, the university club. And we moved in there. It was right across from the Japanese Weather Service headquarters. And we moved in there, and we stayed in there about 2 weeks until somebody saw it and said, oh, we got a beautiful thing for the officers here. You're going to have to get out. But we still had nice places to stay. Yeah, well, actually that was we were all skinny when we got there. And we all gained weight when we got to Japan.
How long were you in Japan?
3 months. Well, let's see, more than that. September, October, November, December, January, February. Then I came back.
Do you remember where you were and what you were doing when you heard that the war was over?
I was well, I knew it was getting to be over because we were shipped to let me see, I'm trying to get my dates straight. We knew it was over when they told us they wanted to get an airplane in Atsugi, which was about the 14th of August. So we knew it was ending. And actually Japanese people went to a little island called, I think it was Shiite Island off of, I'm trying to think where it was exactly. Well, anyway, this island, and that's where they actually discussed the surrender terms. So we knew it was coming in August, early August.
A lot of celebration?
No, not really. Everybody's going to wait and see what happened. I don't think I saw any major celebration anywhere in the military. Now, there might have been some, I wouldn't say there wouldn't, but I don't remember anybody really celebrating like you would think they would. You didn't believe it, I think that's part of it.
Can you describe your homecoming when you got back to the United States?
Well, I flew back and, well, see, my wife and I were not doing very well, so that was out of the question. And my folks welcomed me, yes, but no special homecoming. I didn't come back with a large group of people. I stayed there until we finished our studies of the Japanese Weather Service. And I carried with me a lot of information we had on that. And when I got back, I had to finish writing it, along with another fellow by the name of Captain Jack. So we wrote up the history of the Japanese Weather Service. And our study, I did the technical part, looking at their capabilities, and he did the forecasting part.
How did World War II change your life and help develop you into the man that you are today?
That's a good question. Well, if the war hadn't happened, I probably would be running a business that my father had and my brother had, which was an appliance, it was an appliance business. I'd probably still be there. I might have retired by now, but I would have been running a business, most likely. It opened my eyes. The being in the military and being in the war opened my eyes to a world I had never seen. My folks didn't believe in college. They said you don't need to go to college to be a businessman, and neither one of them went. And I found life was different. You needed knowledge, you needed technology, you needed things that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it opened my eyes to a different world, a world that was just new to me. But I think that was good. Of course, the hard way to do it But nevertheless, I think it did open my eyes. And it opened my eyes to say I can do whatever I want to do. Because you had to do things, you weren't trained to do. Your training didn't give you all the knowledge to do the job you did in the war. You had to have a lot of understanding abilities that you didn't know you had. Getting along with people. How does an officer tell a man to do something that he doesn't want to do? I mean, there's a lot of things like that you learn in the service. And I think that changed my life entirely.
There's a lot of talk about your generation being the greatest generation, and personally, I believe it is. Do you have any opinions as to why your generation is perceived that way, and how the war played a role in that?
Well, I think the original idea of that was the fact that because initially we did win the war and give the people a chance to develop themselves again. But I'm not sure that we were as great as we're made out to be. We made a lot of mistakes. But remember, right after World War II, there was a terrific amount of need to be met. Television had been developed before the war. Right after the war, people began building stations and radios, and the development radios and television just sold like this. Everything began to develop. People began to come up with ideas. Refrigerators were much more popular. And everything that you call became developed during that period of time. We were mercantile people, I guess you'd say, our generation. We brought the people material aids, a lot of material wealth. Did we bring it mental health? Did we settle down everything? It seemed like we did. But then sometimes I'm not so sure. Sometimes I'm not sure that we really thought everything out the way we should have, and actually considered the repercussions of what we were doing when we were doing it. The greatest generation, I've often wondered, there is no generation that's the greatest generation. I think everybody is just about the same. We go through the same things in different ways, in different places, but I don't think there's any big difference. I don't pretend to be that. I just did my part, continue to do whatever I can, and maybe it's because we do that. Maybe that's why they think we're the greatest generation. Here I am at 91 and a half, no, I'm at 92, still doing things, because I like it.
Here's a tough question. If you could have one thing you'd like to pass on to your great-great-great-grandkids 150 years from now about your service to your country, what would it be? What would you want them to know about you?
That I love my country, that I consider the United States to be the best country in the world, that I believe I have a responsibility, and that they do too, to maintain that, to keep it that way, and understand what freedom really is, that freedom is not the freedom to just do whatever you want to do, it's a responsibility. And I think the biggest thing is that they educate themselves, get all the education they can, because that is important for the future. And be able to think. Don't just say, because somebody tells you it's this way, don't say that's accepted without question. Satisfy yourself with what is happening and really what you believe is happening. Because everybody has ideas that are different, and they're not all right. So I think you've got to be able to have a questioning mind, an educated mind, and the ready to adapt to whatever has to be done.
Is there anything else you want to add, Mr. Becker?
Well, we're talking World War II, really, aren't we? Talking after that. I would say that the world was really a tough war in many ways for all of us, being away from home so long and not being back. But all in all, I think it was worth it. The problem now is to be able to keep it. And we've had a lot of problems doing that, we'll always will. All I can say is I'm proud of what I got into, I'm proud of what I did. I'm not ashamed of any of it, and I think that, I hope that everybody else feels the same.
Sir, can you tell us about a
Well-
trip that you took in Japan?
Well, yes, one of the things is weather people, we like to know what's going on in the weather, and nobody saw any reason for any problem, so we took a small group of us and went to Nagasaki and made weather observations. That was what the purpose was. We wanted to see what it was. Well, all I can tell you, it was just nothing. And I'd seen Tokyo, which was burned down, but there's nothing like Nagasaki with just nothing there. I mean, just gone. And so we spent, not too long, about several hours making the observations we wanted to do, and then we left. And of course, we didn't know we shouldn't have been there. And all of us eventually ended up with blood problems. But it was something that, I'm glad I did it, because we did see something that not everybody saw. And of course, today it's built up again. But how do you explain nothing? I see the pictures today in the tornadoes. Some of that looks like that. Looks just like that. Nothing left. Just gone. It's hard to understand. That's a horrible weapon. We had to use it, no question about that. But it's a horrible weapon. And it's affected everybody's life.
What had you been told, though, when you went in initially? What had happened, or what had you heard about the bombing?
Well, we knew it happened. Of course, during the early part, the last part of the war, we knew it happened, and we knew it had been damaged a lot. We didn't know how much, but we knew it was supposed to be destroyed, but we didn't know what that meant. Until you see it, you don't understand. You just can't understand. Even today, it's hard to believe. And I look at those pictures, today's pictures in the papers, and some of them look a lot familiar.
When you went there, were there people
Some people
walking around like trying to find stuff?
There
or?
were some, yes. Yeah.
I assume that you got there by vehicle, is that right?
Yeah. Right.
So as you're going in toward there, I mean, is there, obviously I've never seen anything like this, I would envision that you start driving in and start seeing a little bit of damage, and as every mile you go further,
It was worse.
more and
It
more
kept
was
getting
like
worse,
that.
yeah. It was hard to believe. It was hard to believe. We'd heard about it, but we never saw it. Till we saw it, you just don't know.
And at what point in time did you realize that there was medical problems that could arise from that?
After we got back to the States. Never even dawned on us. Because the military hadn't emphasized that. So it didn't dawn on us.
How long did you say you were there?
Oh, just a day, a few hours, not a day, a few hours.
Did you get a chance to take any photographs when you were there?
There were photographs taken, but I don't have them. I don't know where they are.
Just after you left Japan, I think in 1946, what did you do after that, though, after your time back in the States?
I initially went to station in the Washington area, rewriting the final report. And when we finished writing the final report, I said, well, maybe I'll see what's going on the outside. I got out for a short time, and then my brother and I didn't get along, and so I went back in the service. And then I stayed until I had the orders to go to DuLine.
How many years total were you in the service?
What's that?
How many years total were you in the service?
15. See, I only had 5 more years, but my daughters had to come first.